The title of this paper, Not All Homemaking is Housework, is borrowed from an essay entitled Throwing Like a Girl by the American philosopher Iris Marion Young. Young's essay explores the ambivalence of the values of house and home. The endeavour of running a household, large or small, involves a variety of practices and objects. Many of them are mundane and ordinary on the face of it, and yet they can compel considerable psychic and physical energy, not to mention financial commitment. In her essay, Young draws a distinction between homemaking and housework. For Young, routine and recurrent acts such as cleaning, sweeping, and changing diapers count as housework. They can't be invested with creativity or individuality. By contrast, homemaking consists of the activities of endowing things and practices with living meaning. In Young's words, living meaning gives people a context for their lives and individuates their histories. To better understand the difference between housework and homemaking, Young invites us to reconsider the idea of home and its relation to a person's sense of identity. The relationship between the home and a person's identity was very much at the forefront of my recent doctoral research into the lived experience of homemaking. I use qualitative research methods which place the individual's reality, their perceptions, feelings, and lived experiences at the centre. In informal conversations in 25 South London households, I encouraged homemakers to talk in an unstructured way about their subjective experience of producing their homes, and to reflect on their motivations and constraints in doing so. Placing the transcripts of these conversations side by side with photographic images of their interiors, I created a body of rich experiential data. I use this data to gain insight into the ways in which individuals creatively make meaning through their domestic practices and possessions. Before presenting two fragments from that material, I'd first like to briefly consider ideas of identity and home. Concern with identity, or the question of who am I, lies at the core of human experience and social relations. Increasingly, the metaphor of narrative is used as a way of conceiving of a person's sense of themselves in contemporary cultures. The notion of the narrative identity, or storied life, refers to what Dan McAdams describes as an individual's internalized, evolving, and integrative story of self. Thinking about identity in this way proposes that humans are natural storytellers. It suggests that in modern societies, we make sense of our lives and explain who we are to ourselves and to others by organizing our inner lives into a unified and internalized story form. Self-narration is a creative act. In a material world, things matter. Individuals interact with their environment, and the things they surround themselves with and interact with are chosen for their symbolic meanings. Things stand for other things. In short, contemporary individuals are meaning-centered, and objects can be regarded as material resources for narrativizing the self. What Atfill refers to as the making and unmaking of different life stages of identity. The home is a prime site for exercising agency over and self-expression through materiality. Described by Bachelard as our first universe, ideas of home as a haven and symbol of mother love resonate universally. However, each of us conceives of a unique home from our own experience, memory, and imagination. Referred to by Dovey as an experience meaning, home is a place where we can expect to see intensive identity work and meaning-making taking place. How do we recognize identity work and meaning-making in the home? How can we investigate what is actually going on in homemakers' minds when they're choosing, arranging, and disposing of objects in their homes? Because home life takes place behind closed doors, insight into the ways in which domestic practices and possessions help us to understand ourselves in the world is elusive. In my research project, I endeavoured to access the subjective experience of homemaking in unstructured face-to-face conversations with homemakers. At a given moment on a given day, I was welcomed into a participant's home and for a short space of time invited to enter their intimate domestic orbits and share their private worlds of meaning. I've chosen 2 moments from this research material to illustrate how individuals creatively weave possessions and domestic practices into their self-narrative. As I present each excerpt, I'll locate the object or practice in the narrative and reveal the meaning in the object or practice. My first excerpt spotlights the storying of a possession. The excerpt is taken from my conversation with Jess. Jess is a seasoned online marketing executive in her 40s who'd separated from her husband 18 months prior to our conversation. Even though she was the one who had left, she had been heartbroken, having anticipated that she'd be married for life. Following the breakup, Jess found herself in a liminal phase as she adjusted to her new status as a single mother and to her new home, a terraced house in need of modernisation. In her narrative, Jess drew a parallel between the creative process of transforming the house and the act of reinventing herself. She described knocking down walls and redecorating to her own taste as therapeutic. Jess showed me her living room, which she decorated in what she called a minimalist aesthetic of white surfaces and strong colours. She said, I just sort of wanted something that would be quite, well, funky is a terrible word, isn't it? Also not traditional. The visual and emotional focal point of the scheme is the portrait of Jess's grandmother that hangs on the chimney breast. The painting depicts an attractive woman in an exotic costume. Jess went to great lengths to display the painting to best effect. She recounted, that picture, this room was decorated to, that's my grandmother. She was a stunning woman when she was younger, which is quite funny because she didn't think she was. She was made to believe that she was plain, which is quite bizarre, isn't it, looking at that? And I wasn't encouraged to hang it in any of my marital homes. My ex-husband didn't like it very much, so I've always wanted it to have pride of place. And so I've always wanted a red leather sofa. So I bought the red leather sofa. I wasn't sure about the wall colour behind. I mean, it had to be dramatic. And so my cousin and I, and a lot of match pots, and the picture sort of painted lots of bits and held the picture and the sofa near till we found the right one, the one that looked right with her. Jess's narrative suggests a personal identification with her predecessor, whose qualities, we are told, were apparently suppressed. A more overt meaning lies in the storying of her husband's dislike of the painting, and Jess's wish to make it a focal point. In material culture studies, the space of the living room is regarded as actively involved in objectifying the preferred self. Making the portrait the centerpiece in that space gives onlookers a powerful clue as to the way Jess is storying her reinvented self. As funky, not traditional, attractive, defiant, and newly liberated to follow her own preferences. The second illustration of meaning making focuses on a homemaking practice. It's taken from a conversation with Susan, a professional and single mother who lives with her university-age daughter. Susan is taking voluntary retirement and plans to move from the London suburbs back to her childhood home in Somerset. An adolescent during the 70s, Susan represents herself as a woman who recognises and militates against the iniquities of a patriarchal society. Her view of the home as a traditional site of female oppression underpins her understanding of homemaking and fuels resistance to the traditional gendered role. Here's an exchange between Susan, her daughter, and myself. We don't clean much. We don't do much cleaning at all. I generally don't. No, we can't bear it. It's just a nightmare. Domestics aren't our forte. No, they aren't at all. Do you clean anything? Bodies, my own body. No, not really. As Susan shows me around her home, she points out the dust that's been left to accumulate on the surface of furniture. In Susan's narrative, these surfaces, or what she calls her fine dustscapes, have been deliberately crafted as a political statement. The act of negligence is storied as a creative and deliberate subversion of the female domestic role, and a protest against the tyranny of domestic labour. Susan says being house-proud doesn't necessarily mean everything is submerged in pledge or anything like that. In Susan's storying, her homemaking practice of allowing dust to gather is harnessed as a key component of her self-representation as a liberated woman. To recap the points of my discussion, the theme of this paper, Not All Homemaking is Housework, is taken from an essay by Iris Marion Young. Young distinguishes homemaking from housework, suggesting that homemaking consists of the making and preservation of meaning, which helps people individuate their histories. I found it useful to consider the relationship between home and identity within the framework of the story itself. This notion sees individuals as natural storytellers who organize their experience and thoughts into cohesive, internalized narrative form. Since individuals engage with the material world, they weave the meanings of possessions and practices into their self-narrative. The home is a prime site for exercising agency over and self-expression through materiality. And to illustrate this, I presented two excerpts from my research material. The first located an object in the narrative, and the second storied a practice. I then expanded on my reading of their meanings in the context of the narrator's biography. Young explains that dwelling in the world means that we are located among objects, artifacts, rituals, and practices that configure who we are in our particularity. I hope these two examples from my research offer a flavour of identity work in the home and of the ways in which we endow homemaking practices and objects with meaning and story them to embody that particularity.